More than 100 people killed in just one day in Syria's rebel-held areas of eastern Ghouta and Idlib. They were supposed to be part of the so-called de-escalation zones, but the bombing has intensified. So what triggered this and who can stop it? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Foliba Thibault. The truce was supposed to bring temporary relief to hundreds of thousands of Syrians suffering from severe food and medicine shortages. Instead, Russian and Syrian government forces launched a new wave of airstrikes and shelling, plunging besieged rebel-held areas into even more despair. More than 100 people have been killed in the past 24 hours in eastern Ghouta, just outside the capital Damascus and Idlib province. Activists have described it as one of the most violent days in the nearly 7-year conflict. The regions targeted by the Syrian government and its Russian ally are supposed to be in the so-called de-escalation zones, part of a Russian-led ceasefire deal for territory held by the rebels. The UN says the increasing violence is making a mockery of these zones and has called for a month-long truce to allow the delivery of aid. Now, the 4 de-escalation zones were created after many rounds of talks in Kazakhstan's capital, Astana, and were meant to reduce violence, protect civilians, and ensure humanitarian access to mainly opposition-held areas. Russia, Turkey, and Iran, who signed the deal, act as guarantors. Now, the exact borders of those zones remain unclear, but they cover parts of Idlib and Latakia province, western areas of Aleppo, and northern areas of Hama. The second zone is eastern Ghouta in the northern countryside of Damascus, where over 400,000 people have been besieged by government forces for the past 4 years. The third de-escalation zone is in parts of northern Homs. And finally, the last one is further down to the south along the border with Jordan. So let's bring in our guest for today's Inside Story. Joining us in Moscow, Dmitry Frolovsky, political analyst who researches Russian affairs in the Middle East. In Beirut, Hisham Jaber, a retired Lebanese army general. And joining us also from Arezzo in Italy, Joshua Landis, director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Gentlemen, thank you for being on Inside Story. Welcome to the show. Dmitry, in Moscow, if I can start with you. Russia was the main guarantor of these de-escalation zones, and now it's leading the onslaught of airstrikes in Idlib province, and civilians are bearing the brunt of these strikes. What happened to Russia wanting to reach a compromise in Syria?
Well, I think if we look at what's the Russian general policy in Syria, it's important to look at what's happened in Sochi just recently. And this, the conference that took place is pretty much is a part of the single Astana-Sochi peace process. And by Russian standards, there has been a success. There has been right now there is a way for creating a constitution in Syria, somehow to transitional body. And so right now, Russia pretty much feels that it's on the path for bringing the Syrian reconstruction to Syria, and at the same time doing it on own terms. By solidifying
but how can they talk peace in Sochi and Astana, as you say, and talk of reconstruction when at the same time they're bombing these areas in Syria? Well,
again, Russia, even though Putin has announced that they're gonna start to withdrawing troops from the country, it is never Moscow is never about to leave Syria, and the bases there will stay for many decades for now. And Russia obviously won't stop bombing Syria unless this 75% of the territory right now pretty much will be controlled by Damascus. I mean, we could speak that the northern part of the Syria, the so-called the buffer zone created by Washington, will remain intact, but the majority of Syria, 75%, will be right now pretty much whether attacked by Bashar Assad or Russian until the control will be there resumed fully.
Joshua Landis, the agreement on the de-escalation zones had many people thinking that the war in Syria could finally be winding down. Were these ceasefires ever meant to hold, in your view?
Well, the ceasefires were really negotiated by for the United States because everybody wanted to fight ISIS. The United States was very eager to fight ISIS. ISIS is now largely destroyed, and all the great powers are trying to grab as much land as they can. The United States has grabbed 28% of Syria in the north, with most of its oil and good resources. Turkey is grabbing Afrin and wants to consolidate in Idlib. And Syria, of course, is trying to take the last pockets of rebel resistance. And that's why the Houthi is being pounded. They're moving down towards the Jordan border and, of course, making the big push to keep the Turks from taking much of Idlib. So they're trying to take back Idlib province. This is the end game as people jostle for control. Turkey and America want leverage. Assad wants as much of his country as he can get.
Hisham Jaber in Beirut, your view on this. The first weeks of 2018 certainly have been very bloody, a very bloody period in Syria's 7-year civil war. What do you think the strategy is here from the Assad government and its Russian ally? Why are we seeing this new push, this aggressive push at a time when they are winning militarily on the ground, when they've regained so much territory?
Of course, when Moscow tried to find a peaceful solution, tried to play the role of sponsor in Sochi, Astana, etc., on the land, we have to make advance in the land, to make gain in the military success. Still, look at the map in Syria, you find eastern of Furat is American control region, especially where the Kurds are, and the western side of Syria, especially in Idlib and north and Afrin and Aleppo and Hama and Homs. Moscow is playing is playing the role of the sponsor of find a solution. It's normal that military escalation is normal, especially in Idlib. After the shut down the Sukhoi, you know, they took advantage. Russia, Moscow took advantage from this for escalate their operation in order to solve the problem of Idlib. Later on, with the cooperation of Turkey, Turkey was given, you know, a price, you know, for example, an exchange of Idlib was given Afrin a green light from Moscow, a yellow light from Washington, for example. I think the scenario in north of Syria will be like a separated thing. Afrin.
Right. There are several fronts, as you say. There are several fronts, as you say, and I just want to come back to what happened in Idlib over the weekend. You say that the current offensive we're seeing from the Syrian government and Russia is normal militarily, and at the same time, we're seeing that the rebels are not backing down. I mean, the rebels, were involved in an incident this weekend where they're said to have used a man-portable air defense system to shoot down a Russian warplane. This is considered a sophisticated weapon, Hisham Jaber. Where would they have found this, this weapon? What kind of support are the rebels getting right now, and where is it coming from?
I'm not saying right now who gave those missiles to the rebel and when. I believe two, solution. Some observers said most of them was given by providers within the last 3 years, like because they were provided by several most sophisticated weapons, but was telling by the provider not to use it until a new order. The other solution, they pretend, some observers said they was taken from Syrian military bases, but this, this solution is difficult to believe.
Right.
First of all, the Syrian use SAM-7 as a missile land-air, and the air defense system of Syria was not, no
Sure.
one tell us that they took such weapons. Second, they were shelling by the Syrian Air Force several times more than 3 years. 3 years. Why didn't use it?
Okay.
Now,
I see your point.
Through Turkey.
Yeah. I see your point, and I just want to hear from Joshua Landis on this, because we want to talk a bit more about this incident in Idlib. And Joshua, where are the rebels getting their support from right now? Where is it coming from? And how concerned should the Russians and the Syrian government be that they have access, it seems, to such sophisticated weaponry now?
Well, we don't know exactly where the weapons come from. The foreign minister of Saudi Arabia said a year ago that it was going to supply the Syrian rebels with ground-to-air missiles to shoot down Russian planes. It's quite possible that it actually did it, and it wasn't just threatening. It could be Turkey. It could be many places where these get smuggled in. Clearly, the rebels desperately need these sorts of ground-to-air missiles in order to neutralize Soviet planes. The the Russians have said that they're just simply going to fly their airplanes higher in the air where they won't be vulnerable to these missiles. So this is a deterrent, but it won't make a big difference, I don't think. This is the end game. Syria is trying to push the rebels from Idlib into Turkey and get rid of them. Turkey does not want that to happen, and it's going to help the rebels push back a little bit, probably.
Dimitri, do you agree with Joshua there about what Russia's end game is in Syria right now? And I also want to ask you about, whether Russia is concerned or not about the type of weapons the rebels seem to be using now, and the fact that they're not backing down despite the intense airstrikes and the intense offensive against them.
Well, first to answer your question about the weapons, again, there's been always concern about this kind of weapons in Russia. There are some ideas that the weapons are coming probably from the looted storages all across the Syria after the Syrian army, or they perhaps coming from Ukraine, or might be somehow transported thanks to Qataris or Saudi or Turkish efforts. So we never know. But in Russia, there is definitely concern about it. And I think one of the reasons, if you look at what's happened to the plane, is pretty much this whole situation when the plane got shut down. It happened primarily because the plane was flying lower than Russians usually expected. And there's also has been some human factor, as many people in Russia say, and so that's pretty much has been kind of pilot's fault as well, because the Russians pretty much know that the rebels, they always have this kind of weapons. Was only a matter when they use it, and well, the Russians will make mistake for the plane to get shot. If saying in terms of the intensifying fighting, well, right now it's pretty much, if we look at Idlib, it's pretty much one of the last remaining strongholds in Syria. And those remain fractions of rebels that are still fighting there. Obviously, they will fight until the end. These people just have nowhere to go. They just have to fight. They couldn't get back through Turkish territory. They couldn't give up. So they couldn't do anything.
Right.
So for them, fighting at the last resort. And obviously, right now, fightings have been intensified. And yeah, Russians understand as well.
Hisham Jaber in Beirut, just coming back to the current government strategy, the Assad government strategy right now, and looking specifically at eastern Ghouta on the outskirts of Damascus, which has been under siege now for almost 4 years by government forces. That strategy doesn't seem to have worked. There are some reports now suggesting that the Assad regime could be considering a ground offensive there. How risky would that be?
Yeah, first of all, let me tell something. About the missile, whoever provide the insurgent by this missile or other missiles, and when those missiles delivered to the insurgent through the borders of Turkey, whether 2 years or 3 years ago. Second, why Assad? What is the strategy of Assad? First of all, in the north of Syria, Assad is taking advantage from the situation in north of Syria, and the Turkish involvement in Afrin is making a very big gain on the land, success in the triangle between Aleppo and south of Idlib and north of Hama. It's very important to protect the highway between Aleppo and Damascus, and every day he can make a new advance in order to solve the problem of Idlib on the table later on with the second and the eastern side of Damascus. It's only two places, two fronts the Syrian army is fighting in. Now the Syrian army is in a situation of break, of relax. He has only two fronts. Since the Ghouta, eastern Ghouta, it threatened Damascus itself every day, every week, some shelling to Damascus. Why not take advantage first this time and to let a big offensive against it to solve, try to push away the insurgent from Damascus.
Let's move the discussion forward now, because with all of this happening across Syria, the United Nations has said it's investigating reports of another chemical weapons attack in rebel-held areas. The US has accused the Syrian government of continuing to use these types of weapons. Bombs suspected of containing chlorine were reportedly dropped in Douma in eastern Ghouta on Thursday, and this was followed by another attack later in the town of Sarakeb in Idlib province. Activists' video appears to show people being treated for suffocation, and a foul smell was reported. The Syrian government denies it was behind these attacks. Joshua Landis, Donald Trump last year, when there was another chemical weapons attack in Syria, launched airstrikes. There was a targeted strike in response to that airstrike, to the chemical weapons attack used at the time. And many had seen this as a key test of Trump's leadership on the world stage. Do you think we could see the U.S. take a similar action now that there are new reports of chemical attacks used against civilians?
It's possible. The U.S. seems to have made a small distinction between nerve gas, which was used in Khan Sheikhoun and where the United States responded very vigorously, that had been prescribed in the original deal with Syria in 2013. The chlorine, which is not as anywhere near as deadly, but of course is very bad, is very widespread. It's used for swimming pools, clearing water. It's used for pharmaceuticals. It's all over the place. Very hard to keep it out of Syria. And the United States, I think, is reluctant to get drawn in to reprisals against Syria on the use of chlorine. But it may do it. It's unclear what Washington's policy is right now. It seems to be going through a period of change. We saw Tillerson and others say that they want regime change and that they're going to stay in Syria until Assad is removed from government and that there are free elections run by the UN. This is a very new policy, and I'm not sure it's really sunk in yet in Washington in all the different corridors of power. But we'll see.
Dimitri, what would the Russian reaction be if the U.S. were to decide to get further involved in the Syrian conflict in response, for instance, to this reported chemical weapons attack?
Well, I think here it's interesting if we look at the U.S. policy in Syria in red perspective, and we'll measure like its U.S. involvement over the past few years. I mean, like. And for many in Russia right now, what's happened with the creation of a buffer zone and Trump strikes during the last year, it's pretty much seemed that in the beginning, Russians thought that the Trump policy towards Syria will be different than Obama's. And right now, people actually think that Trump is actually going to take more aggressive stance towards Syria. And this pretty much has been proven recently by this creation of the buffer zone. At the same time, I think that Russians are pretty confident that the United States will not strike Syria, as has happened in the last year. And pretty much they believe that the whole U.S. influence will remain within the established buffer zone.
Speaking of changing policies on Syria, is Russia today still intent on having Bashar al-Assad remain in power in Syria? Because at one point they seem to be flexible almost on the idea of Assad not being in power. What's their position right now on Bashar al-Assad?
Well, I think that's actually a great question, because if you look at general how Russia sees Syria, and I think there has been a very mistaken consideration that Russia has made all of its bets on Bashar. I mean, like, for Russia, there's only one thing that matters for Russia is having in Syria a reliable and stable client state that could supply this sort of foothold for its navy base, for its bases and its influence in the Middle East. And it doesn't really matter whether it's Bashar Assad or somebody else, but it has to be somebody who is loyal to Russia. Right now, obviously, there is no such alternative that is very pro-Russian in Syria. And I think in the upcoming years, I mean, we'll probably have Bashar Assad remain in power, and then we'll see how it goes.
Hisham Jaber, what is your view of Russia's endgame? And this now is beyond Syria. What do you see as Russia's endgame in this region right now, in the Middle East? And who do you think is benefiting from prolonged Russian involvement, whether it's in Syria or other areas in the region?
Russia has interest in Syria. It's for the first time. It made it clear that arrived to the Mediterranean, made a naval base in Tartus, and air base and also Latakia. Anyway, Russia didn't come to Syria to leave tomorrow. Has a lot of interest and has want to influence in Syria, and Russia don't want occupy Syria, but want an influence. Syria seems a very rich region, for the oil and gas and natural resources. And we saw in Deir ez-Zor, the fighting there around the oil resources. Anyway, Syria want its part in the Syrian cake. It's normal.
Russia,
whether Assad stay in the regime, Russia want to its part in the Syrian cake, whether Assad stay in the regime or not. Assad present a large part of the Syrian people.
Right.
Russia want a regime not hostile to Russia, to Moscow, and protect its interests in Syria. That's all what Russia wants.
Okay, well, let me give the last word to Joshua Landis in Arezzo. And Joshua, I want to come back to the current situation in Syria today. This civil war is now entering its 7th year. We've seen in the last 48 hours more than 100 people killed in Idlib, in eastern Ghouta, civilians really bearing the brunt of this conflict. The humanitarian situation is disastrous, as the UN has said. Where does this all leave, this current escalation? Where does this leave peace efforts, whether it's Astana, whether it's Sochi, whether it's Geneva? Can there be a negotiated solution still in Syria, or is this war only going to be won and settled on the battlefield?
I think it's going to be settled on the battlefield. It seems quite clear. Both, Geneva is really a dead process. Geneva is hooked up on asking for Assad's removal. It doesn't look like he's going to be removed. Astana is really a vehicle for getting the surrender of the remaining rebel groups. And that's going to be done with this fight on the ground. And that's why you're seeing the war escalate now, because there's a scramble for the last bits of Syria as everybody tries to get leverage. America, Turkey trying to increase their hold on Syrian territory, and Assad is racing to drive the rebels out and not to give any more pretext to Turkey to take more land or to the United States to increase its position in Syria. So this is I think we're seeing the end of this, and there's an all-out rush to grab the last bits of Syria that are held by rebels.
Wow. Certainly an unfortunate situation for the civilians there. Thank you all for taking part in this discussion. Dmitry Frolovsky, Hisham Jaber, and Joshua Landis. Thank you for being on Inside Story. And thank you for watching. As always, you can watch this program again anytime by going to our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Fuli Batibo, and the whole team here at Inside Story, thank you for watching. Bye for now.